You ever wonder what happens when you try to bury water? The first crack sounded like a gunshot under 6 inches of polished concrete, sharp and sudden, echoing through a neighborhood that used to smell like fresh-cut grass and overpriced cologne. But that night it smelled like wet earth pushing back, like something alive underneath waking up after being suffocated. And I was standing at the edge of my property line, boots sinking half an inch into soil that wasn't supposed to move, watching a row of million-dollar homes shift just enough to make their porch lights tremble, just enough for people inside to pause mid-sentence and feel it. That subtle, creeping wrongness. And all I could think was, this started months ago. The day they decided my creek didn't belong there anymore. The day the sound of rushing water got replaced with the low grind of cement trucks and the sharp chemical bite of wet concrete filling something that had been flowing freely for over 80 years. I remember the heat that afternoon, Texas sun beating down, dust sticking to sweat, the metallic clank of rebar hitting the ground as crews moved like they owned every inch of it. And maybe they thought they did. Maybe Margaret Holloway told them they did, standing there in her pressed white outfit, like she was unveiling a luxury feature instead of killing a natural drainage system, calling it an upgrade, calling it community improvement, like a living creek was just an inconvenience to be erased. I didn't say a word, not when they blocked the flow, not when the water backed up for the first time in decades, not even when the smell changed. Because if you've worked with water long enough, you learn something most people don't. Water doesn't argue. It doesn't complain. It doesn't need permission. It just waits. And I've spent 20 years studying how it moves, how it seeps, how it finds the smallest weakness and turns it into a pathway. So while they were pouring concrete and celebrating their clean, dry landscape, I was watching the ground, watching the subtle shifts, the way the soil darkened in places it shouldn't, the way the grass stayed damp long after the sun went down, the way silence replaced the constant hum of flowing water. And silence like that, it's never empty. It's pressure building. It's energy with nowhere to go. And I knew exactly where it would end up, because the land remembers what it's supposed to do, even when people forget. And Margaret Holloway, with her perfect sidewalks and her perfectly staged neighborhood, she forgot something simple, something fundamental, something you don't ignore if you understand the ground you're standing on. You can cover a creek. You can redirect it, you can pretend it's gone, but you can't make water disappear. Not here, not in this kind of soil, not with this kind of slope, and definitely not with homes sitting right in the path of where that pressure was going to build. I could hear it before anyone else did. That faint, deep shift under the surface, like the earth taking a breath it had been holding for months. And as another crack spidered across a pristine driveway, I just stood there, hands in my pockets, watching everything unfold exactly the way it was always going to. Because I didn't destroy anything. I didn't touch their foundations. I didn't lay a single brick out of place. I just let the water go where it always wanted to go. And now, months later, it finally had somewhere to push back. I learned to read land the same way some people read faces. You look for tension, for subtle tells, for the small details that do not lie. And this land had been talking to me my entire life. Long before Margaret Holloway ever stepped foot here with her glossy brochures and her ideas about improvement, long before concrete trucks lined up like they were paving over a problem instead of creating one, because that creek was never just a ditch. It was the reason this entire stretch of property stayed stable through every heavy rain, every dry spell, every season that tried to push it too far in one direction. My grandfather used to stand right where I was standing now, hands on his hips, boots planted in the same soil, telling me that water always wins, not fast, not loud, but always. And back then I thought he meant floods or storms or something dramatic you could see coming. But what he meant was quieter than that, more patient, the kind of force that builds underneath you while everything above looks perfectly fine, the kind that waits until people get comfortable, until they build their foundations and plant their flags and start believing they are in control. I was not always this calm about it. The day they started pouring concrete, I felt it in my chest like pressure, like something was being sealed shut that should never be sealed. I could hear the mixer churning from half a mile away, that low grinding hum that never really stops once it starts. And when I walked down to the edge of the creek bed, the smell hit me first, wet cement and dust, and something chemical that did not belong in a place that used to smell like running water and clean mud. I watched as they filled it in section by section, smoothing it out like they were erasing history, like they were correcting a mistake instead of making one. One of the crew guys wiped his forehead and told me it would look better this way, said it would increase property value. I just nodded, because explaining groundwater pressure to someone holding a shovel is like explaining gravity to someone who thinks they can outrun it. And Margaret, she showed up halfway through, sunglasses on, clipboard in hand, smiling like she had already won something. She told me the neighborhood needed modern drainage solutions, said the natural creek was inefficient, messy, unpredictable, and I remember the way she said unpredictable, like that was the worst possible thing land could be, like nature needed to follow her schedule. I asked her if they had run a proper soil analysis, if they understood the clay composition under these lots, if anyone had mapped the seasonal water table shifts. She gave me that tight smile, the kind that does not reach the eyes, and said they had engineers handling it, like that was supposed to mean something to me, like I had not spent 2 decades being the engineer people call when things start moving the way they are not supposed to. So I stepped back, literally and figuratively. I stopped arguing, stopped showing up to meetings, stopped trying to explain what was coming, because there is a point where warning people becomes pointless, where the only thing left is to let the system play out. And that is exactly what I did. I watched the seasons change, watched the first light rains soak into ground that no longer had an outlet, watched the grass stay greener in patches that should have dried out, watched small dips form in perfectly graded yards. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone would panic over. Just enough to tell me the pressure was building. Just enough to confirm what I already knew. That water had not disappeared. It had simply gone underground, spreading out, saturating everything beneath those expensive foundations, waiting for the moment when weight and gravity and time would all line up in exactly the wrong way for them, and exactly the right way for the truth to surface. By late fall, the neighborhood looked perfect on the surface, like something out of a brochure. Clean sidewalks, sharp edges, lawns cut to the exact height the HOA handbook demanded. But if you walked it the way I did, slow, paying attention, you could feel the difference under your boots. The ground did not have that firm resistance anymore. It gave just a little, barely noticeable unless you knew what solid ground was supposed to feel like. And I knew. I always knew. I started taking my morning walks earlier, just before sunrise when everything was quiet enough to hear the small things. The faint squish under the grass in certain spots, the way puddles lingered longer than they should after a light rain, the way sprinkler systems did not just water the surface, but seemed to disappear into soil that was already full. And that was the word that kept coming back to me. Full. The ground was reaching capacity, and nobody else seemed to notice. Or maybe they noticed and chose to ignore it because everything still looked expensive, still looked controlled. I remember one afternoon standing near the row of newly built homes on the lower lots, watching a contractor adjust a decorative stone border while a homeowner complained about minor cracks in their driveway. Nothing major, just thin lines spreading like spider webs. The contractor blamed temperature changes, normal settling, used all the right words to make it sound harmless. But I could see the pattern. Those cracks were not random. They followed stress lines, pressure from underneath pushing up unevenly. And that is when I knew the timeline had started, not weeks, not days, but a countdown that had already begun the moment they sealed that creek. Margaret drove by in her SUV around that time, slowed just enough to roll down her window and give me that same polished smile, asked me if I was enjoying the improved view now that the creek was gone. I told her it was quiet, and she nodded like that was a victory, like silence meant success. But silence in a system that used to move is never a good sign. It means something is blocked, something is building. I went back to my workshop that evening and pulled out old survey maps, cross sections of the land from before any of this development existed, layers of soil composition, drainage paths, elevation, shifts measured in inches that most people would never think twice about. And I traced the original path of that creek with my finger, following it downstream right through the exact stretch where those homes now stood. It was not just a coincidence. It was design. Water had been flowing there long before any foundation was poured, and now it had nowhere to go but into the ground, into the clay that holds moisture like a sponge until it cannot hold anymore. I set up a few simple markers over the next couple of weeks. Nothing anyone would question, small stakes, reference points, just enough to measure subtle movement. And every few days I checked them. At first the changes were almost nothing, fractions of an inch, But then it became consistent, a pattern you could not ignore once you saw it. Downward. Always downward, slow, steady, inevitable. And that was the moment I stopped thinking about if it would happen and started thinking about when, because everything I was seeing, everything I was measuring, it all pointed to the same conclusion. The ground was no longer supporting what was built on top of it. It was giving way, one layer at a time, and the only thing missing now was the trigger, the one event that would push it past the point where it could quietly absorb the pressure and turn it into something no one in that neighborhood would be able to ignore. The rain started as a low whisper against the windows, soft enough that most people in that neighborhood probably found it relaxing. The kind of steady drizzle that makes everything smell clean and new. But to me it sounded different, heavier somehow, like each drop carried weight, like it was pressing down on something already stretched too far. I stepped out onto my back porch. Just after midnight, the air thick with moisture, the scent of wet soil rising stronger than it should after only a few hours of rainfall. And that was the first sign, not the rain itself, but how fast the ground responded to it. I walked out past the edge of my property, flashlight beam cutting through the dark, and I could already see it. Water pooling in places that used to drain within minutes. Grass bending under the weight of saturation. The surface holding more than it could handle. Because underneath, there was nowhere left for it to go. I followed the slope down toward the lower lots, boots sinking deeper with each step, an extra inch. Then two, the kind of change that does not happen overnight unless something underneath has been building for a long time. I paused near one of my markers, knelt down, and ran my fingers along the measurement line I had scratched into the stake just a week earlier. The difference was not subtle anymore. Nearly an inch of drop, uniform, consistent, and accelerating. I stood up and looked toward the row of houses, their lights glowing warm and steady. Everything above ground still pretending to be normal. But I could hear it now, faint but unmistakable, a low shifting sound beneath the rain, like wet earth adjusting under pressure, like something slowly giving way. By morning the rain had picked up, steady and relentless, the kind that fills every low point and tests every weakness. And that is when the call started, not to me, but to each other, neighbors stepping outside with coffee in hand, noticing things that did not quite line up anymore, doors that did not close smoothly, windows that stuck halfway, driveways with shallow dips where there had been none the day before, small things on their own. But together they painted a picture no one wanted to see. I drove past slowly, watching it unfold in real time. A man standing in his driveway staring at a crack that had widened overnight. A woman pressing her hand against her garage wall like she could feel the shift through it. And then I saw Margaret again, standing near the entrance, phone pressed tight to her ear, her posture rigid, her voice sharp even from a distance, the confidence from months ago replaced with something tighter, something forced. She glanced at the ground more than once, like she was trying to convince herself it was still solid. But the rain kept falling, and the ground kept changing, and by the time the afternoon rolled in, it was no longer subtle. Sections of lawn had sunk just enough to hold standing water. Fences leaned a few degrees off where they were set, and the cracks in the driveways were no longer thin lines but clear separations, the kind you could trace with your finger. I parked at the edge of the development and watched as a city inspection truck pulled in, tires pressing into softened ground, leaving impressions that did not bounce back, and I could see it in their faces as they stepped out. That moment when professionals recognize a problem that has already moved past prevention. One of them crouched down near the curb, pressed his hand into the soil, and looked up toward the houses with a slow, understanding nod. Because at that point it was no longer about opinions or HOA rules or landscaping preferences. It was physics, it was pressure, it was water finally reaching the limit of what the ground could hold. And as another deep, quiet shift rolled underfoot, I realized the trigger had already been pulled the moment that rain started. Everything after this was just the inevitable result catching up to the surface. By early evening the rain had settled into something steady and unrelenting, the kind that does not flood streets all at once but seeps into everything slowly, methodically. And that is when the neighborhood stopped pretending nothing was wrong. You could see it in the way people moved now, faster, sharper, stepping carefully as if the ground might not respond the way it always had. I parked along the main road and watched as a small group gathered near one of the lower houses, voices low but tense, Someone pointing at the corner of a foundation where the brick line had shifted just enough to break that perfect symmetry these homes were built to show off. Another homeowner trying to laugh it off, calling it normal settling. But his voice did not carry confidence anymore. It carried hope. And hope does not hold up structures. Physics does. One of the inspectors walked past me, boots coated in mud that clung thicker than it should. And I heard him say something to his partner about saturation levels, about subsurface instability, words that do not mean much to most people, but mean everything when you understand what is happening underneath. Margaret was still on the phone, pacing now, her heels pressing into ground that left faint impressions with every step, each mark lingering just a little longer than the last. And that is when I noticed something shift in her expression. A brief flicker of recognition, like she was finally starting to connect what she was seeing with what she had dismissed months ago. She caught sight of me across the street and walked over. Fast, controlled. But there was urgency in her movement now, something that had not been there before. She asked me what I thought was going on, not with authority, not with that polished certainty she used to carry, but with a question she did not want to ask out loud. I looked past her at the row of homes, at the slight but undeniable tilt that had begun to form, at the way rainwater pooled along the edges where it should have drained clean, and I told her the ground was saturated beyond its capacity, that the water had nowhere to go. She shook her head immediately, said they had drainage systems installed, engineered solutions, like repeating it would make it true. I nodded slowly and said those systems were designed for surface flow, not for a blocked natural channel, not for pressure building underneath layers of clay that expand and soften when saturated. And I could see it then, the moment the explanation landed, not fully, but enough to unsettle her, enough to make her glance back at the houses with a different kind of awareness, a deeper one that comes too late to change anything. Behind us there was a subtle but unmistakable shift, a low settling sound that rolled through the ground like a quiet wave, and a few people turned at the same time, instinctively, because even without understanding the cause, they could feel the change. One of the homeowners called out that their front door would not close anymore. Another mentioned a new crack running across their garage floor, and the inspector raised his voice just enough to get attention, telling everyone to step back from the immediate edges of the structures until they could assess what was happening. No panic, just controlled caution. But that tone carries weight. It signals that something has moved beyond normal. I stayed where I was, watching the water continue to fall, watching it collect, watching it disappear into ground that could not hold it much longer. And in that moment, everything was exactly where it had been heading for months. Every decision, every ignored warning, every inch of concrete poured into a space that was never meant to be sealed, all of it converging into this slow, undeniable shift, not dramatic, not explosive, just steady and unstoppable, the kind of change that does not need force to prove a point, only time. And as the rain kept falling and the ground kept softening, I knew they were only seeing the beginning of what that pressure was about to do. The rain did not stop that night. It just kept layering itself over ground that had already taken more than it could hold. And by sunrise, the neighborhood looked the same at a glance, but felt completely different underfoot, like something fundamental had shifted out of alignment. I walked the perimeter again, slower this time, measuring without tools because at this point I did not need them. The changes were visible, undeniable. The gentle slope that used to guide water away now held shallow sheets of it, reflecting gray sky in uneven patches, and the soil beneath my boots gave way with a soft, dull response, not collapsing, just yielding, which is worse, because yielding means it has not failed yet. It is still trying to carry weight it cannot support. I stopped near one of the lowest homes where a small crowd had gathered again, quieter now, less denial, more confusion. A man crouched near the edge of his driveway, pressing his palm flat against the concrete like he could steady it, like contact would tell him something useful. And maybe it did, because when he stood up his expression had changed, the kind of realization that comes when something you trusted starts behaving differently. One of the inspectors had a measuring rod out, calling numbers to his partner, documenting elevation changes that should not exist over a single night, and I caught a glimpse of his notes. Fractions of an inch adding up in patterns that pointed in one direction, down, always down. Margaret stood off to the side now, no phone in her hand, no clipboard, just watching. And that was new, the absence of control, the absence of answers. She looked smaller somehow, like the space around her had gotten bigger, like the authority she carried before had nothing to anchor to anymore. She saw me again, and this time she did not walk over right away. She hesitated, and that hesitation said more than anything she could have asked. Eventually she did approach, slower, careful with each step, as if she could feel the difference now. 2. She asked me how bad it was, not if there was a problem, but how bad. And I told her the truth in the simplest way I could. The ground beneath these homes was saturated beyond stability. The water had filled every available void in the soil, reducing its ability to support weight. And until that water had a way to move again, the soil would continue to compress under load. She blinked like she was trying to process it in real time, like she was searching for a way around it, some solution she could still implement. And she asked if pumping the water out would fix it. And that is when I shook my head, not because it was a bad idea, but because it was too late for simple fixes. I told her pumping might relieve some pressure temporarily, but the source of the problem was still there, the blocked channel, the altered flow path. The system that had been functioning for decades was gone, and without restoring that, any solution would be temporary at best. She looked past me toward where the creek used to run, now a smooth strip of hardened concrete, clean, controlled, completely still, and I could see the connection forming in her mind, the delayed understanding of cause and effect, the realization that what had been removed was not just water but movement, and without movement, pressure builds, and when pressure builds in saturated clay, it does not release evenly. It shifts, it settles, it sinks. Behind us there was another subtle drop, this time enough for a few people to step back instinctively, not out of panic, but out of awareness, and one of the inspectors spoke up, advising residents to avoid placing additional weight near the edges, to stay clear until further evaluation could be completed, his tone steady but firm, the kind that does not invite argument. And as I stood there listening, watching the ground continue its slow adjustment, I knew the process had fully transitioned now, from warning signs to active change, from possibility to certainty, because once soil reaches this level of saturation under load, it does not simply recover on its own, it continues to move until it finds a new equilibrium. And in this case, that equilibrium was lower than where those homes had been built to stand. By the second night, the rain had turned from steady to relentless, the kind that erases the line between sky and ground, and the neighborhood no longer tried to hide what was happening. The changes were too visible now, too widespread. I stood near the edge of the lower lots again, watching as temporary caution tape fluttered in the damp wind, marking areas inspectors had flagged, not as danger zones, but as places where the ground could no longer be trusted to behave the way people expected. The air smelled heavier now, not just wet, but saturated, like the earth itself was breathing slower, struggling under the weight it had been forced to carry. I could hear it more clearly too, that low, almost imperceptible shifting beneath everything, like a deep structure adjusting in slow motion, and every few minutes there would be another small change, a driveway line widening just enough to catch water, a fence leaning a fraction more than it had before, nothing sudden, nothing dramatic, just a steady progression that no one could stop once it had started. A couple stood near their front yard, shoes sinking slightly into what used to be firm grass, looking at their home with a kind of disbelief that had no words, like they were waiting for it to correct itself, for everything to return to normal if they just stood there long enough. But ground does not correct itself once it has crossed that threshold. It adapts to new conditions, and those conditions were still changing. Margaret was near the inspection team now, listening more than speaking, her posture no longer upright and controlled, but drawn inward, as if she was trying to take up less space in a situation that had grown too large for her to manage. One of the inspectors was explaining something to her, gesturing toward the slope, toward the pattern of settling. And I could tell by the way she nodded slowly that she understood enough now to realize this was not a surface issue, not something cosmetic or easily patched. This was structural, systemic, rooted beneath everything they had built. I walked past them without interrupting, because there was nothing left for me to add that would change the outcome. The explanation had already been written into the land itself, and it was unfolding step by step. I made my way back toward where the creek used to run, that strip of hardened concrete now slick with rain, water sliding over it instead of through it. moving faster on the surface but going nowhere that mattered. I crouched down and placed my hand flat against it, feeling the cold, the stillness, the complete absence of what used to flow there. And just beyond the edges of that concrete, I could see the ground swelling slightly, water pushing outward, searching for space, for release, finding none. And that is when another deeper shift rolled through the area, not loud, not sharp, but broad, like the entire lower section had settled another fraction all at once. Enough for several people to step back instinctively. Enough for the inspectors to call out again, directing everyone to keep distance from the structures while they continued assessments. And I stood up slowly, looking out across the row of homes that no longer sat quite the way they had been designed to. Their clean lines now subtly distorted by forces no one had accounted for. And I realized this was no longer just about water pressure or soil saturation. It was about momentum, because once the ground starts moving like this, it does not stop halfway. It continues until the pressure is redistributed, until the system finds a new balance. And that balance does not consider property lines or construction budgets or aesthetic plans. It only follows physics. And physics had already taken over this situation completely, leaving everyone else to catch up to. A reality that had been building quietly beneath them for months. By the third day, the rain finally slowed, not stopping completely, but easing into a steady drizzle that felt almost quiet compared to what had come before. And that is when the full picture revealed itself, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of undeniable changes that stretched across the entire lower section of the neighborhood. I walked the same path again, past the caution tape, past the clusters of homeowners speaking in low, tight voices, and what had once been subtle distortions were now clear misalignments. Front steps no longer meeting the ground evenly, garage doors sitting slightly off their frames, windows reflecting angles that should have been straight but were not, and the ground beneath it all looked different. Not just wet but uneven, like it had settled in. Layers that did not agree with each other anymore. One of the inspectors had set up a laser level across the street, a thin red line cutting across multiple properties, and even from a distance I could see how it broke, how it dipped and rose where it should have stayed perfectly straight. And that line told the story better than any explanation could. The land had shifted in a way that could not be reversed by surface repairs. Margaret stood nearby, watching that line as if she could will it back into place, her expression no longer defensive, no longer dismissive, just fixed on the evidence in front of her. And when one of the inspectors spoke to her again, this time his tone was different, more final. He explained that the settling was progressive, that the soil beneath several of the homes had lost its structural integrity due to prolonged saturation, and that without restoring natural drainage, further movement was not just possible, it was expected. She asked what restoring meant, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it, and the inspector hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. Said it would require reopening the original water path, removing the obstruction, allowing the system to function the way it had before, and even then, stabilization would take time, months at best, longer in some areas. I saw her glance toward the strip of concrete again, and for the first time there was no attempt to justify it. No explanation about improvement or value. Just silence, the kind that comes when reality replaces assumption. I continued walking, letting their conversation fade behind me, because the explanation did not change the outcome. It only confirmed it. And as I reached the edge of my property and looked back across the neighborhood, I could see the pattern clearly now. The entire lower section had settled into a shallow basin, subtle but unmistakable. A shape that matched the old creek path almost perfectly, as if the land itself had reasserted its memory, correcting the surface to match what had always been underneath. Water still moved across the concrete strip, thin streams sliding over it, but along the edges, the ground held it, trapped it, feeding the same saturation that had caused all of this. And I could hear fragments of conversation drifting through the damp air, words like liability, insurance, structural assessment. None of them offering immediate solutions, just acknowledgments of what had already happened. I stood there for a long moment, taking in the stillness that had replaced the constant movement of the old creek and the slow, ongoing adjustment of everything built on top of it. Because this was the phase most people do not expect, not the initial shift, not the first visible cracks, but the realization that the system has already changed, that what was built assumed conditions that no longer exist, and as one more subtle settling ripple moved through the ground, barely visible, but clearly felt, I knew this was not the end of it, just the point where everyone else finally understood what the land had been saying all along. By the end of that week, the rain had stopped completely, leaving behind a stillness that felt heavier than the storm itself. And for the first time since all of this began, nothing was actively changing on the surface, no new cracks forming in real time, no fresh shifts underfoot, just the quiet aftermath of a system that had already moved past the point of control. I stood at the edge of the development early that morning, the air cool, the ground soft but no longer sinking with each step, and what I saw was not destruction, not chaos, but a correction. The lower section of the neighborhood had settled into a new shape, subtle but permanent, foundations no longer perfectly level, driveways sloping where they used to lie flat, fences leaning just enough to catch your eye even if you did not understand why. And across it all there was a pattern, one that matched the natural flow line of the land that had existed long before any of these houses were built. The inspectors had finished their initial assessments, their trucks parked along the street as they reviewed notes and measurements, and their conclusion was already spreading through quiet conversations. The cause was not a sudden event, not a construction flaw in a single home, but a systemic failure tied to altered drainage and prolonged subsurface saturation. Words that sound technical but translate into something simple. The ground had been forced to behave differently than it was designed to, and it responded by returning to what it knew. Margaret stood near the concrete strip again, no longer directing anything, no longer issuing instructions, just looking at it like it had become something unfamiliar, something she could not reconcile with the plan she had once defended so confidently. She noticed me standing there, and this time there was no hesitation, no distance. She walked straight over, her steps careful but steady, and when she spoke her voice was quiet, stripped of that polished edge it used to carry. She asked me if it could have been prevented, and I told her yes, not sharply, not with satisfaction, just plainly, because the answer did not need emphasis. I said the creek was never the problem. It was the solution. It carried water away before it could build pressure. It kept the soil balanced, stable, and once it was sealed, everything that depended on that movement started to change. She looked back at the homes, at the slight but permanent tilt that now defined them, and for a long moment she did not say anything, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to reinterpret. Only the result. A few homeowners stood nearby listening, not to me specifically, but to the explanation that had already been confirmed by measurements and reports, and I could see it settling in for them too. That quiet understanding that this was not going to be fixed quickly, not with surface repairs or temporary solutions. The land would need time to adjust. The drainage would need to be restored, and even then, what had shifted would not simply return to its original state. I walked back toward my property after that, leaving the conversations behind, because my part in this had never been about confrontation or correction. It had been about observation, about understanding what was already in motion and letting it unfold. I stopped one last time where the creek used to run, looking at the concrete now dry on the surface, but still holding water along its edges, still trapping what should have been moving freely. And I could almost hear it, not the sound itself, but the absence of it, the missing flow that had once defined this place. And as I turned to head back, I glanced once more across the neighborhood, at the homes that now sat differently on the land than they had been built to, and I thought about how quiet the whole process had been. No single moment you could point to as the cause, no dramatic event you could blame, just a series of decisions that ignored how things actually worked, and the steady, patient response that followed. Because in the end, nothing here was random, nothing here was sudden, it was all predictable, all inevitable. And the only thing I had really done was step back and let the truth surface on its own. Because justice is not loud, it does not need to announce itself, it just waits, and when it arrives, it fits perfectly into place.